Today it's going to be Christine Peterson, our very dear Foresight former president and fellow in policy, who is going to be interviewed by Caroline, our junior fellow. Just quickly, how this came up is that at our last meeting, which was our junior fellows meet our senior fellows meeting, Caroline and Christine had a great conversation, and Caroline subsequently offered to sort of do this again with more fellows, because she thought the advice she got was very valuable. And I was, of course, immediately extremely excited to take her on this offer, because Christine has been, an amazing mentor for Alison and I along the years, because she not only has a serious knack to give precious advice on research, on career, on life management, but also really knows how to empower our mentees into carrying on the very ambitious tasks they have set for themselves. So Christine, I guess that's also my way of saying thank you for your years of mentorship. I'm excited that all the other fellows who joined us today are going to be able to benefit from it. And that was it for a short introduction. Okay, Caroline and Christine, I think you're going to start with some questions, and then we'll go to a Q&A phase. Hi, Matthew, who joined us. And please, the floor is yours. Get started.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So I'm Caroline, and I'm the Artificial Intelligence Governance Junior Fellow for Foresight this year. And I'm going to interview Christine. So Christine Peterson is the co-founder and past president of Foresight Institute. She writes lectures and briefs the media on coming new powerful technologies, such as nanotechnology and life extension. She serves on the advisory board of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and has served on California's Blue Ribbon Task Force on Nanotechnology and the editorial advisory board of NASA's nanotech briefs. She has often directed Foresight conferences on molecular nanotechnologies and organized Foresight Institute Feynman Prizes. So her work is motivated by a desire to help Earth, environment, and traditional human communities avoid harm and instead benefit from expected dramatic technology improvements. This goal of spreading benefit led to an interest in new varieties of intellectual property, including open source software, a term she is credited with originating. And Christine is also really great to talk to, and so that's why I wanted to bring the benefit to you, the Junior Fellows of 2020. So thank you for being here, Christine.
I'm glad to be here, Caroline.
Great. All right. So first question, big question. The first one I came to you with is like, what do you think is a good method for planning one's life and career, given all the uncertainties in the world, and how to use it with a topic, for example, like mine, which is AI safety, AI policy?
Right. So this is a very important question for everyone. Really everyone at any stage of their career, but especially for the Foresight Fellows and other people who are early stage career. So the Foresight Fellows tend to be in their 20s and 30s for the most part. So we're still early stage. And the basic question is, how do you plan a career when the world, at least in the year that we're doing this now, 2020, seems pretty chaotic? It feels like a very chaotic situation. But this is not unique. There have been other times when it's been pretty uncertain. So what method can we use to do useful planning in such a bizarre environment? And Foresight, to do our planning, we prefer the scenario planning methodology, which is, rather than trying to select one scenario, one future to plan for, it's, especially when times are very uncertain, it just seems crazy to try to pick one. Rather than that, we would strongly advocate coming up with a range of scenarios and trying to come up with career strategies and things you can do now to prepare for multiple strategies, multiple scenarios. So let's be more specific. So this video is being made for the Foresight Fellows, who in general are a high-achieving bunch of individuals. That's how they get to be Foresight Fellows. So life in general for them has been relatively fortunate. I'm not saying that the Foresight Fellows have had no bumps in the road for their career, but I am saying that somehow they've been able to overcome them and continue to make positive progress. So to come up with, say, let's look at, say, 3 scenarios for your future careers, or either for the Foresight Fellows or for anyone in their, say, 20s and 30s who's been doing fairly well. So the first scenario is, will we continue to make gradual progress? So I'm making sort of an upslope here, but it's not super high upslope. So this is sort of the mid-range scenario. Things continue to go about as well for you as they have in the past, which is pretty good. In other words, it's not a flat scenario. It's a somewhat up scenario. Things are going well. You're making progress. You're making a career. You're making a name for yourself. Your reputation is growing. And that's sort of the default, in the sense that if the external world continues as it is, if your personal health and family situation continues as it is, and you're able to cope with any issues that come along, that will continue. And that the funding sources that are currently funding you now will continue at about the same level or a little better. But there's no particular reason to think this is what's going to happen, right? So it's very useful to have at least 2 more scenarios in mind. One of them I'm going to call the most optimistic scenario, which might be your stretch goal for your career. So let's say you continue to do well, but you reach a much higher level of achievement. You start to shine, your star shines more brightly, more people notice what your work is and how well you're doing. You're seen increasingly as a leader in your field. And this, of course, for our Foresight Fellows is not unusual. It's not surprising when this happens, but we'll call that, a higher rate of increase for your career. This generally is going to require some kind of significant achievement, and we'll talk later about what those kinds of things can look like. The third scenario, and I think this is important to do, even for those of you who are very optimistic, is a flat or slightly down scenario. And now I'm not implying that there's any fault of yours or that you are making mistakes that are causing this, but the external world can change drastically. In the last few decades, we've been relatively lucky. There haven't been any world wars. There haven't been any global depressions. But if you look at the past century, you can see those things are not, they can happen for sure, right? And in fact, in this year of 2020, primarily due to COVID, we're closer to a global economic depression than we have ever been, I think, since the 1930s. So this is a scary situation, and it's something that all of you, both the Foresight Fellows and everyone who is early stage career, needs to take into account, which means you may be flying high right now, and there may be funding for your career that, although you have to work quite hard to get it, you can get it. But in times of extreme stress, whether it's extreme economic stress or a major military action, a lot of the types of activities that Foresight Fellows do can be downgraded in the public perception of importance. Now, Foresight doesn't agree. We think, we selected our Foresight Fellows because we're super enthusiastic and feel that their work is critical, regardless of the economic or military situation. But the general public, political leaders, philanthropists even, can change their views quickly on what is urgently important. And that would certainly apply to things in the policy space, such as AI safety, AI governance, things like some of the things that some of our other fellows this year are working on, such as preventing a space arms race, legal engineering for the biosphere, sustainable soil management, all of these super important policy type issues can be downgraded pretty fast under extreme stress. So what I'm saying is you can lose your funding. And so I would suggest having a backup plan for your career. So you have many skills already that you are applying in your preferred area of work. It's good to have a plan in the back of your mind for how you would deploy those exact same skills in another area if the funding disappears for your current effort. Because, everyone here on this call, all the Foresight Fellows, have been fortunate enough to work on something we truly care about and deeply believe in. In tough economic times, sometimes that's not possible. So it's good to have a backup plan. And in any of these scenarios, whether it's the current fairly good scenario, the optimistic stretch goal we'll be talking about, or this backup plan, it's a good idea to pay close attention to where the funding comes from that is supporting your work. Where does that money come from? Who is responsible for bringing it in? And where are they getting it? How are they doing that? If you learn those skills, then you can take at least some control of that process eventually. And I would strongly advise not to ignore that. It's much more comfortable to let somebody else handle that side of things, the financial side. It's not necessarily a fun thing to do, and it's not always directly relevant. It feels like you're taking time away from your primary purpose, but unless you get control of that funding stream and are able to figure out how to generate funding into your work, you will always be dependent on someone else's competence, right? And you know how dangerous that can be. Depending on someone else's competence is a very risky thing. Even if whoever's doing it now is super competent, they could leave. They could become ill. Anything can happen, right? So it's very smart. Learn, find out who's bringing in those funds, find out how they're doing it. You're going to have to do that at some point as you proceed through your career and become more senior. You might as well start now, because the sooner you learn that stuff, the more secure your career will be and the better you'll be at bringing those funds in. So I think that's all I have to say right now about that first question, Caroline. So let's move on to our next question.
That's great. Yes. So talking about these changes that you were talking about, such as like an economic crisis or something like that would lift up our opportunities, how do you foresee these like important events, such as like an economic crisis? How do you, after all, you co-founded the Foresight Institute, so like how do you foresee, what methods do you use to help you doing that?
What I like to do in trying to figure out how things are going, how is the world going? The main thing that I like to do is what is called weak signals research. And that primarily refers to the question of where do you get your information? The great majority of people, even very smart people, get their information sources from media that makes them feel comfortable. And by that, I mean media that matches, for example, their worldview, their political beliefs, that supports their own assumptions about how the world is going to go. And of course, once you put it that way, you realize, oh my gosh, that's a very risky thing to do. There is no reason to think if we limit our information sources to those that are comfortable and match our existing beliefs, we are not learning. We are not getting the uncomfortable information that that is the result of going out into the world with a more open mind and saying, well, I'm going to read things that might make me uncomfortable. I'm going to read things that I disagree with or that I initially disagree with. And things that don't match my current political beliefs, perhaps, or my desires for what the world is going to look like in the future. I'm going to read things written by people who I strongly disagree with in some way or another, and I'm going to look for that little nugget of truth. It may be small, but there's generally there's a reason why people feel the way they do, why they see the world the way they do, and there tends to be some kind of nugget of truth. Either it can be large, it can be small, but unless you look for it actively, you're going to miss major pieces of information. And I've seen this so many times here in Silicon Valley. Lots of folks here they tend to run kind of democratic, liberal on the political spectrum. That's mostly what we have out in this general area of the world. And so the media they read are of that type. And repeatedly in my lifetime, I have seen my good friends be stunned and shocked at how an American election goes because they've only been reading the media that makes them comfortable. Whereas because I do this weak signal research, I've been much more eclectic in my reading. I've read things that make me very uncomfortable. And so I have not been shocked by how these elections go. And the reason it matters is that funding for science and technology research, at least government funding in the United States, tends to flow with political party, who's in charge in Washington, D.C. So civilian science and technology research is usually better funded by the Democrats. Possibly military science and technology might be better funded by the Republicans. So it's important when you're planning your career to at least have some clue of how things are going to go. Because if it's going to go in a way to cut off your funding, you need to prepare for that. And at least in the US right now, civilian science and technology research funding is not very good. And it could get worse. If the Democrats come in, it could get better, right? That's why it's important to go out and read things that make you uncomfortable. Generally, you'll find some little part of it that's true, and it will give you some insight into why there's this whole world of people who disagree with you on whatever it may be. So in my case, for example, one of the bizarre information sources I was pulling from was there were 2 Chinese vloggers. They were in China. One was American and one was South African. They had married, I believe, women in China, and one started a family there, and they were riding their motorcycles around China, sending out raw video to the world. And so that's a way to find out, well, what's going on in China that hasn't been laundered through either the Chinese media or the American major media that has a particular worldview. So the fact that China was cracking down was no surprise to me long before it started showing up in the American press. So I think that does it on that question, Carol.
Yeah, and another question that I'm interested in looking at Alison and Lou, for example, like if you're not doing like technical work, for example, on AI safety, like technical AI safety work, like what do you think is especially useful? And I think that when we first talked about it, you referred to Alison and Lou. So.
Right. So our Foresight Fellows fall in 2 main categories. Some of you are doing direct scientific and technical research. Others of you are more on the policy side. You are trying to steer technologies, sciences and technologies in ways other than doing the work directly yourself. And I certainly fall in that category as well. So for those of you who are not hands-on 100% in the lab or doing code, but who are trying to steer technologies in positive directions, how do we do that? Well, the first necessity is, even though you're not a scientist or a researcher directly in the science and technology area that you're trying to influence, it's really important to be very brave about jumping in and attempting to understand it as best you can. And I would assert that it's possible to do quite well at that. One can gain a tremendous amount of understanding just by being pretty fearless at saying, you know, I'm going to learn as much as I can about this that's useful to my work. You don't have to go 100% and become a researcher, but you can become very comfortable with all the terminology and get to the point where you can really interact with the actual researchers directly and have their respect as someone who has a pretty decent understanding, far better than a lay understanding of the science and technology. So that's first, being fearless about jumping in and learning things. There are no barriers to what you can learn. Just because you didn't major in a particular topic doesn't mean you can't learn a tremendous amount about it, should you choose to do so. And secondly, and this is a function that is valuable in many different ways, which is you can form a bridging function. For example, we've got our researchers over here, we've got our policymakers and decision makers over here, whether they're governmental, whether they're in foundations, they may be in business, maybe the CEO. These two types of people do not communicate well with each other in general, right? The decision makers do not have the technical or science background, and they have no interest in gaining it in most cases. The researchers do not necessarily admire these other folks for their lack of interest in the science and technology. So they do not share any common terminology. So this is one of those transferable skill sets that I was talking about before. You can serve as a bridge between these two. Now, I'll mention to the researchers, some of our fellows are researchers 100% of the time. It doesn't hurt for you to gain these bridging skills as well. You will get more funding if you do it, right? If you can talk to these are the folks with the money. So someone has to explain to them what is the problem we're solving, why it's important, why we're confident we're going to solve this problem, how long it's going to take, how much money it's going to take, and do it in a way they can understand. So both for our policy fellows and for our researcher fellows, I would say learning to do those bridging skills is super critical. And it's something that will pay off for you throughout your whole life, being able to communicate scientific and technical ideas in an understandable fashion to those who are not full-time. So that's how I would suggest that the policy folks can be super valuable, and you can take that skill anywhere. If you can communicate that well, you're a super valuable person across the board.
Right, yes. And talking about a topic that would be between policy and technical as well, like what is one topic that you think would be promising to work on right now?
Yeah, we've been talking about this at Foresight for a while, which is that there is a neglected area that I think there's tremendous opportunity to make big progress on, and that is in the area of computer security. Right now, when I look at our 2020 fellows, we have people taking on some huge topics. I mentioned preventing the arms race, responsible biotechnology, reducing nuclear proliferation, heading off problems from engineered organisms, legal engineering for the biosphere, sustainable soil management, you name it, we're taking it on. But I'm not seeing anyone directly taking on this issue of computer security. And the reason it's so critical is that the democracies in general spend a huge amount of money and time and effort trying to do defense. They try to do defense of the countries, of the people, of their systems in physical ways. You know, they have nuclear weapons, they have traditional weapons, and on and on and on, trillions of dollars. And yet the digital sphere is highly insecure. I mean, this has been demonstrated dozens of times repeatedly at every level, certainly in the United States government, and I think in other governments as well. So many of our systems are, I would say, completely insecure. I would be particularly nervous about, for example, the electrical grid in not just in the U.S., but in many other countries as well. So it's an area that we are not paying much attention to, and if someone who's watching this wants to get involved, Foresight can point you in the right direction for how to get up to speed on it and what might be useful to do.
Yes, that sounds very valuable. And so one of my ideas for, like, now we can think about the best scenario you were talking about at the beginning, like the optimistic scenario, and how to get there. So, for example, if I wanted to create a nonprofit similar to Foresight, what are the important things to consider?
Right. So we mentioned earlier 3 scenarios. There's the backup plan for your career, the things continue to go about the same way and continue to improve gradually, sort of mid-range scenario. And then there's the stretch goal where things take off like a rocket and you become a real star in your field, which, given that you're Foresight Fellows, is would not be surprising. So how do you do that, right? Now, I know you're all working very hard. That goes without saying. So you're trying already very hard to achieve in your area, but to be seen as a major leader of your generation, people in their 20s and 30s in your field, you're going to have to produce some sort of achievement that is really is not seen as the usual thing. You know, this is a very unusual, stellar type achievement. If you're in the lab, you're already trying to do this in your research, but many of you are not in the lab. And even for those of you who are in the lab, I would say it's useful to think about what type of intellectual product could I produce that would represent my views and really start something new in the world. And by that, I would say, think about the major books in your field, books that really change the direction of the field. Does your intellectual work to date and the ideas that you currently have, are they new enough and are they comprehensive enough to constitute the beginnings of a change in the field? In other words, can you write such a book? Can you write a major book in your field that will be seen as, you know, the most important book of maybe the year or maybe the decade in your field? Now, it doesn't have to be a book. Some people have been able to project this type of intellectual leadership using some other method. For example, it could be a truly amazing video. It's possible. It could be, you may have seen some people who become leaders in their field by doing a spectacular blog, believe it or not. Some people are able to establish leadership in their particular area by doing an amazing TED Talk. There are a lot of ways to do it. I tend to think in terms of books just because that's how Foresight got started, was with a major book. So I would say if you want your career to do this thing, to take off in a more spectacular way, think about what this intellectual product could be. For those of you who are in the lab, it might have to be a discovery or an invention, and I assume you're already working hard to do that. But if it is going to be a book or an intellectual product in terms of writing or the other forms I mentioned, think hard. I mean, do you have an idea that's that big? Or are you that good at synthesizing things? Can you take everything that's happening in your field that feels very disjointed and pull it together into a paradigm that is going to make sense to everyone? And if you can, consider actually writing that book. Now, what you can do in that case, let's say, regardless of whether you're a researcher or a policy person, let's say you want to be your own boss. You want to make the decisions. You want to set the agenda for an organization, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit. You can always join. You can try to join an existing one and try to rise up through the ranks, but there are a lot of other people doing that. If you do have unique ideas and the strength to do it, you can start your own institution, your own organization. If you're in academia, this might be a new center or a new institute. If you're in the for-profit space, it could be a new company. If you're in the nonprofit space, it can be a new nonprofit. And the last one, the new nonprofit, is what we did with Foresight. There were the ideas in our originating book, which was, the title is Engines of Creation. It's still worth reading. Even though it was put out in 1986, it's still inspirational today. And we felt that this was a big enough intellectual achievement that it would attract a lot of attention and would support a new organization. And that was correct. And here it is, 2020, we're still going. We've passed the reins on to the new generation. And that meant that we had all those years where we were our own bosses. We could decide what was important and work on that. And as long as we were able to bring in the funding, as I mentioned before, it's critical to learn how to bring in the funding. As long as you can do that, you are the boss. You determine what should be happening. And it's a wonderful thing to do if you can pull it off, if you have the ideas and the drive, and if you have put in the work to learn how to do the funding. And the last thing I would mention about this question of, well, how do you get your career to do this rocket movement? First, you envision in your own mind what this looks like, right? Maybe it's the new center or institute. Maybe it's the new nonprofit, the new company, whatever it is. Or maybe you're comfortable moving up through the ranks in an existing organization. Maybe you are an assistant professor at a major university and you'd be perfectly happy to go for tenure there. And just rise up through the ranks that way and continue to be a leader in your technical field, your scientific field. That's fine too. How do you achieve these things? Well, one way you do it is develop a very clear vision of what that looks like and really get that strongly in your mind. And the other is you talk about it with people. You tell people, here's what I want to do. I want to start this. I want to do this. Do you have any advice for me? Do you have any contacts for me? People in general want to help. Most people want to help you. And if you can clearly express what you're looking for, what you're trying to learn, the types of people you're trying to connect with, many people will say, oh, let me connect you up with my friend who's in that space. Let me introduce you to my brother-in-law who does that, my sister-in-law. People will try to help you. So the more you discuss your vision of the world and what you're trying to accomplish, the more help you will get. So develop that vision and talk it up. Just tell everybody, this is what I'm doing. And that's how new things start. First you talk it up, and someone with a strong vision pulls people together, and eventually it gets implemented. So that, Carol, that would be my summary for how do you go about it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, last question. So all these different scenarios require sort of like being sort of like financially independent. And or at least financially secure. So how do you think we should think about money and savings to achieve all those things?
Right. Well, first, all of the Foresight Fellows and probably any others who may be watching this, chances are you're high achievers, you work very hard, and many of you tend to be super altruistic, and you give and give and give and work very long hours. And you don't necessarily think about your own needs, whether it's your own financial needs, your own health, your own personal needs in general. Many of you are givers. You're dedicated to a cause, and I understand because I've been there. I lived a lot of my life that way, for sure. So, and that's great. However, you need to keep in mind that this is a marathon, not a sprint. In other words, this is a long-term effort, not a short-term effort. And there are certain things you need to pay attention to and take care of so that 10, 20, 30 years from now, you're still able to do what you want to do. The first is your health. I'm not going to go into that. That's pretty obvious, and we could do a whole nother one about that. But in terms of finances, you need to make sure, we tend, especially when we're starting new things, we tend to sacrifice our own finances in order to be able to work on a particular area we care about. And that's fine for a short period of time, but it's not a sustainable strategy. The sustainable strategy is to make sure that you have the income that you need to support a lifestyle that's going to enable you to continue to pursue your goals over the decades. And that means a sufficient income so that you have good health insurance and you don't have to worry about paying your bills. And you can buy a house someday if you want to. If you want a house, you deserve to have a house someday, right? You need to be able to pay off your educational loans. If you want a family, you should be able to have a family, right? And all of these things take money. So what I suggest to people who are starting out is try, and I know this is hard, but try hard to save money. And it's pretty straightforward. You just cut your expenses, your living expenses and your lifestyle down so that you make sure that it's lower than your income. So you're not accumulating debt. If you have debt, you're paying it off at whatever rate you can. And eventually you start to save. Saving is freedom. Having money in the bank is freedom. And I want freedom for you, right? I want you to have the freedom to determine your own career, your own goals. And so it's just super important to not get addicted to the, here in the Silicon Valley, you see people who spend a tremendous amount of money on restaurant food or super high rents because they want to have a very nice place to live. And that's just not the way to save money, right? My first 5 to 10 years out of college, I saved hard. I saved a lot. And that's what enabled me to quit my job and start Foresight. And I haven't had a regular job since then. I've been, someone running my own institute. So it's hard, but I would say if there's any possible way, save money in your 20s and 30s. It will pay off for sure. So just another comment, I mentioned that you deserve to have a family if you want. Whether you want a family or not, it's not a bad idea to have a life partner. And that might be a spouse. It might just be a long-term life partner without the marriage certificate, either way. But the point is, if you have someone by your side who is on the team with you, then when things get tough, you have somebody to help you out, whether it's one of you gets ill, one of you loses their job, whatever it may be. There's some, generally at least you'll have at least one earner among the two of you who is still employed and is able to pay the rent. Another benefit is that in the effective altruism movement, they have the term earning to give, which is when someone chooses deliberately to not work on what they think is the most important, but instead to earn a lot of money and deploy those funds on that cause through other means. And within a couple, one of you can take turns earning to give, so that the other one is able to fulfill their professional goals working on a cause that may not pay very well. It's really nice to have at least one significant professional income. And it doesn't have to be the same person for the whole relationship. You can take turns, and I've done that. It works quite well, I thought. So, if anyone wants to talk about any of these topics, either to talk about your individual career, how to save money, how to pursue your stretch goal, how to find that life partner, any of these types of things, I'm perfectly happy to do a one-on-one session as we did with Caroline. Just email to, you can email directly to me, peterson@foresight.org, and we'll set that up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was so valuable, and I got a lot of insight. And I wanted to know if people here had some questions to ask Christine. So if you have one, please maybe raise your hand in the chat, and we can give you the floor. So yes, Tessa has a question. All right, Tessa, you have the floor.
Sure. You had mentioned sort of the conflict, the balance between saving money and paying high rent. And I guess I wondered how you think about how important it is to be in particular cities where it feels like lots of things are happening, or in particular locations. I mean, Foresight's based in Silicon Valley. There's obviously a lot of opportunities there. I recently moved back to Canada, where I no longer have to pay for health insurance. So I guess I'm curious how you think about making decisions and balancing those kinds of concerns when deciding where to live.
That's a great question. It's a big challenge, and I think it depends a lot on the specific field that you're in and the particular thing you're trying to achieve. Now, right now, this is being filmed during COVID, of course. Now, during COVID, all of these supposed benefits of being in Silicon Valley pretty much disappear. You know, you can't have these direct personal connections. Everything's online. So right now, things are very different. When we made that decision, it was in the late 60s. And at that time, remember, that was a very long time ago. There really wasn't an internet. In fact, most people didn't have email. So at that time, you really needed to do face-to-face, for sure. There just was no other way. So given the time frame, coming to Silicon Valley was the right decision for sure. Now, in fact, even until quite recently, there was a strong bias for face-to-face interaction, and people just were not used to making major new agreements without meeting face-to-face. It just was not done. The general feeling was you had to meet face-to-face to judge these things. I wonder, ever since about February, that's this year, it hasn't been possible. And yet the world hasn't come to an end, right? Things are happening, new things are occurring, even though we haven't been able to meet face-to-face. So I think a lot of people are starting to say, I'm not 100% sure it's necessary to live in a place with super high rent anymore. I think it's probably going to take another year or two. When we get back to normal, we'll see whether people start emphasizing face-to-face. But, where are you in Canada? What city are you in?
In Toronto, so pretty big city in Canada.
It's a very big city. I'm from Buffalo, so I totally know about Toronto. So the nice thing about, there's a lot of benefits to living somewhere like Toronto. The lower rent, as you mentioned, the health insurance benefits, all those things. And the other thing is there are airplanes, right? I mean, once COVID is done, if you wanted to visit Silicon Valley, quarterly, you totally could. And would people care where you live the rest of the time? No, right? So given the ability to easily visit, you save so much by not living here that I have to say it is more and more tempting to live elsewhere. And I think people are realizing that now, that it isn't necessary to pay super high rents. You can get a lot of the benefits between video calls and occasional visits. It might make a lot of sense to make the decision you've made, at least for now. I mean, you can always change it, right? 5 years from now, you may decide, no, I really need to be some particular place, and you may move there. But for now, it's very tempting. And I think a lot of people are doing that right now. They're saying, I don't need to be in the big city. For folks in my situation who've already bought real estate in these high rent areas, we don't feel that pressure to save. We're already sort of established. But for younger people who are in their 20s and 30s who haven't yet bought real estate, I don't know. I have to say the world is looking different now than when I came to Silicon Valley, and I think there's more and more understanding that it's not always the smartest move to live in the high rent areas.
Thanks. Super interesting.
Yeah, things are really changing. It's good. It's kind of funny that it took COVID to force us all to get really good at video conferencing. But it was kind of, if you remember the early days of COVID when people were still learning, it was a real difficult thing to get, your aunt to learn how to do Zoom or whatever. But now, most people have figured it out, and life goes on. Amazingly, we can do this. It works. Okay. Are there any other questions before we wrap it up?
Yes. Any other question?
I think Matthew should go first because he's one of the fellows, but I also have a question if we have more time.
I'll keep it brief, and it's quite following on from Tessa's question, actually. Like, how much do you perceive that we will go more towards the online way of networking and I suppose group type collaboration? For example, Foresight benefits quite highly from the workshops, but during the COVID period, it's shifted quite drastically into these sort of online salons. And I really wondered we keep saying when it returns to normal, but when we kind of go, let's say post-vaccine, if we get one, do you perceive that we will go back to the kind of more traditional workshops, or do you think by then we'll have actually evolved almost into the way that these online workshops have kind of superseded what we benefited from previously, or do you believe it'll be more of a hybrid kind of bit of both?
I would bet on the hybrid. For example, before COVID, Foresight did 2 physical in-person workshops per year, generally. One in the spring and one in the fall. This year, we are, of course, doing it online, and it has forced us to be super innovative. We have come up with, Allison and Lou have come up with wonderful new ideas for how to make it work for us, and I think it may work super well. However, and we all know this, there are still benefits to face-to-face. Those aren't going to disappear. So my guess is that what we'll do is we will, let's say Foresight continues to do 2 per year. For a while, maybe what we should do is do 1 in person, 1 online, and that way try to get the best of both worlds for a while, while we figure out what really works best. I don't know. It's still early days to see whether the type of collaborations that the in-person workshops were able to stimulate, whether we'll really get those or not from online activities. I have to say, looking at the Foresight salons, we do these online salons, those, I would say, have benefited a lot from the world being forced to go online. Because we used to do those exclusively in person here in the Bay Area, and we could only attract local people. Unless someone happened to be in town, we didn't get them. Now we're getting super wonderful people from all over the world. This just was not possible before. And I think it took a major disruption like COVID to force people to say, all right, I'm going to get good at this because I have no choice. And I'm going to do a lot of them because it's the only way. There's no other way. And it took a huge disruption to force people to do that, and to get up to speed pretty fast. And frankly, those salons are great, but the technology is not really good enough yet to do informal one-to-one networking. As you know, it just doesn't happen, right? You have these breakout rooms, but they don't work very well. There's still a lot to be learned here. So I think, a hybrid for sure. But I think doing more online is going to be here to stay to some extent. It's just so cheap, right? I mean, it's so cheap. It's so easy. And so those are tremendously huge benefits. And the people who get really good at it, not just in presenting themselves, like right now I'm trying to present myself, but in reading you, right? Who are you? It's harder for me to tell who you are than an in-person thing. But I think this is probably a learnable skill, right? So we'll see. It's a great question. I don't know the answer. I would bet on hybrid. What do you think? Do you have a view?
I agree. I think a lot of our current collaborations have really benefited because, as you say, the online sphere has evolved drastically in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
I would say it's a new platform. It's not quite replaced the old platform. So the online platform is significantly better, but it's still missing that kind of in-person accidental conversation, the kind of the over the coffee, the lunch, the whilst queuing, the meeting people you don't know almost accidentally and organically, which you just don't have online.
That's right.
It's very hard to just randomly, I'm not going to accidentally start talking to Tessa or Dan whilst we're queuing to get a coffee.
That's right.
I can interject another. There is a system for that called Icebreaker, but one of the problems is that, so for instance, if you have a scientific conference online, it's not the same because people aren't necessarily going to be fully engaged. You have people that are at their work trying to also do work at the same time and jumping in and out of calls and stuff. Whereas when you have a traditional scientific conference, everyone is forced to be in the same place for several days. So that's another difference.
That's right. That's for sure.
Which someone pointed out to me
I agree completely. And I think we all do that, right? I mean, we've got some kind of call going, but we're actually doing email or playing on our phones or doing something else. I'm often
it's harder.
cooking. Yeah. I'm
it's
cooking.
Hard to isolate. It's harder to,
The other thing that happens at a regular conference is every now and then you go to a conference and you meet someone and the two of you go out into the lobby and you sit there for hours, right? I mean, you never go back to the conference. You just spend all your time with that one person, and that becomes a super important person in your life. Either it's a mentor or a colleague or somebody you write papers with. And, those things, as we said, they just can't happen on these systems right now. Although, I was speculating, as you just were saying, you can imagine the improvements, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully,
this goes on for another 2 years, which I believe will have at least another year where major international conferences are completely suspended. Plenty of time to try and adapt, and we have to adapt, right? In the same way that people adapted to the internet,
right?
To computers.
Right.
One of the really good things that you also highlighted is that we've had the internet for my entire career, but now more regularly I speak to people in 4 or 5 different countries every day, because all of a sudden we've sort of realized, this isn't just a novelty. Like we only ever really used video conferencing if we had to. Right. Even people would fly 4,000 miles for a one-day meeting, when really we should have been doing it online.
Absolutely.
So I think definitely improved I would say it's significantly improved current collaboration, but it's not quite facilitated that new kind of random collaboration yet, which I think it will get better. And yeah, I think I agree with your analysis. I think it will go into a hybrid mode, which I think you like.
Yeah, there's an opportunity here.
Communication anyway. Like we need to have that human interaction as well. We don't want to fully go digital at any point. So I think that's good.
All right, we have one last question, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, Caro. And yeah, just to add a little bit on this, I hope soon, sometime, we get back to a hybrid form, and I look super forward to all of us being able to meet, sometime like in person. That would be super nice. Yesterday, so I'm in Berlin, Aleftina and I met, and I can confirm it's totally different way of interacting, and it was like really lovely, it's just like really great to be able to meet. And I really strongly hope that I'll be able one day to meet you all in person finally. Yeah, it's kind of fun to meet after like having had only online interactions in this really strange context. It feels like, oh, finally. Anyway, I look forward to it. And my question for Christine was, so we've talked about becoming like a leader in your field, but I think it's a question a little bit that is about the tyranny of choice and doing the right thing, which is that, sometimes maybe the major intellectual contribution that you could do is in one field that you might feel is not necessarily the field that is the most important to work on at the moment. And we live in a world where there is at least maybe a feeling of urgency that is very strong from different areas that feel like critically important, with a deadline on them that is like a real deadline, like everyone is going to die if we don't do something about it. So in that context, how do you make a decision about doing the right thing? And maybe sometimes being a leader is not the right thing, and you should, sacrifice like your personal ego for actually choosing a path that supports a cause that may be more important for the world.
That's a great question. And it depends on this. It's obviously a very personal thing. I think most of the people at Foresight am very cause driven. And I've always been attracted to work on things that seemed critically important to me, even if I wasn't going to be a leader. In fact, when I started out in the Foresight area, in the areas that Foresight Institute works on, I was not initially a leader. And that was not particularly my goal. I was okay in a support role. I was perfectly okay with that. And in the early days of Foresight, I was more in a support role. And then over time, I grew into more of a leadership role. So I would agree with you that, at least in my early career, in my early 20s, it would have been much easier for me to go be a leader in, for example, medicine. That was, the path that I was naturally on at that point. But it didn't strike me as, at that time, it did not strike me as the most important thing to work on. So I chose to take a cause-oriented career choice and moved into a support role, not a leadership role. So yes, I think this question you ask is very important. Now, some people are more focused on personal success, and they might choose the other pathway where they go into the field where they more naturally can attain leadership. Maybe it's being the phrase is being a big fish in a small pond. You know, choose an area where you can be a natural leader, even if it isn't as important. But those folks are not necessarily attracted to Foresight Institute. You know, people who are either fellows at Foresight or other young people who might be watching this video, the reason they're watching it is their cause, or they tend to be cause oriented. They want to make the biggest difference in the world, regardless of their own personal status in the movement or in the effort. They want to play a key role. So yeah, I certainly don't regret it. And it's not that one doesn't take a leadership role. I hadn't planned to, and yet here, you know, I got stuck with it. So it just might take longer to attain a leadership role. But it's important to me to work on something I'm passionate about, something where I feel happy that I did my work, that I don't feel it's just to make money. You know, just making money for most people is not going to make you happy. It's not going to make you feel fulfilled. You know, if there's one thing we've learned, it's just getting money and just getting status is not the pathway to being happy in life. So I certainly don't regret my choice. I'm very happy with how it worked out, and it didn't preclude leadership. It just was a different pathway to leadership.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other? And I think that might have been the last question. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Carol?
True. Yes, sounds
Great.
true.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
This has been really fun, Carol. Thank you for setting it up. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.